We're in the center of a three-part series looking at a concept series rather than just a textual one. We're looking at love as it pertains to Scripture. And so last week we were talking about the call to love and how our call to love as Christians is different than the way that the world is called to love. Today we're looking at a spelling mistake. Well, some would agree. We'll see if that makes sense in a little bit. Loving the JYO way. And the passage we're going to look at is a familiar one from Matthew 22, 34 through 40. We're going to look at a few other passages that go along with that as well. So last week it was how our love for God should be different than the way that the world loves God. Well, it's true that we should have a feeling of closeness to God and serve God as a family and go to God in crisis and serve others in His name. We need to love God by making Him priority in our lives and being obedient to His commands. God is deserving of obedient love, which is too often missing in the world. Satan is fine with us loving God in all of the other ways as long as we don't really dedicate ourselves to His Word and His purposes. In the same way, our love for ourselves needs to be different than the way that the world teaches us to love. We live in an individualistic, gain-oriented society where we filter the world through cost analysis. Do you realize that that's a main part of our Western culture, is cost analysis? We constantly evaluate if things that we want or have are worth the cost that we're actually required to pay. Items, feelings, friends, family, jobs, church, God, marriage, anything that costs us more than we expect to get are dropped or exchanged for others that provide the same thing at a better value. This mentality creates multiple problems in individuals and in our society, and it limits God's ability to work among His people. The attitude trains us to put minimal effort and look for the easy way out instead of an all-in attitude. We look to the rich and the famous as ideal because they work very little compared to the amount that they can play. It's the way that our society is focused. A good life is to be like this, where you have very little output and a whole lot of input. You have to do very little and you have all of this freedom and all of this money, and that's kind of the ideal that we reach for. But it doesn't stop at you can see it in our girls' generation, a sense of it. But it's in our generation. It's in those that are close to retirement and those that are past retirement. It's the same mentality. That's the ideal, is to get to a point in life where you have to have very little output and you have a lot of input. Things coming in and a lot less going out. And because of that, most of the people that we interact with on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis have a mentality that is filtering items coming into their life. In contrast to that, our heroes and role models should be those who live honorable lives, that show dedication, that know the cost and go beyond because it's right and it's needed. Our heroes should be those in service and those in uniform, soldiers, police, firemen, nurses, doctors, preachers. People that do right because it's right and they know that there's a cost. But our society doesn't necessarily factor that way. So how does it relate to today's topic about loving ourselves? Well, I see the connection in two ways. The first way is the gain mentality has ourselves at the center. So decisions, the goal of our life is to take care of ourselves, so we need to know what God says about loving ourselves. It's look out for number one. Guess who's number one? That's an attitude that's in gain-oriented thinking. A second reason is the response to this self-centeredness has been a movement to see the role of Christians who live a JYO model. So who knows what a JYO model is? Jesus, others, yourself. So that's a contrast to the just ourselves, which is the big O model. That's it. All you think about is yourself. And everything else is figured into what can I get for myself. So there's a movement to say, no, it's not about that. True joy is Jesus, others, and yourself. The promise is that if you live like this, then your life is going to be pleasing to God. But taken to the extreme, Satan has room to work with this as well. Well, I think that we would agree that living number one, just saying that, the Christian response to life is just to look out for yourself, is not going to be supported anywhere in Scripture. And although option 2 is a better step, and it has a lot of value in looking at the contrast to the way that society looks at things, it can still be on the wrong track. There are problems with the option because I don't really see it necessarily lining up with the life of Jesus. Think of how Jesus and the Gospels, as they record his life, how Jesus' life as recorded in the Gospels would be different if Jesus demonstrated the JYO, or for him, the Father ourselves and Father others and yourself, the FOY model. How would his ministry be different if he didn't take time to care for himself and his connection to God? If it was, okay, Father, what are we here for? Until I meet all the needs of all the others, then I'll take care of myself. Did he heal every sick person? Yes or no? Did he cast out every demon? When he went to bed at night, was there still more that he could have done? More that he could have done for the Father, for the crowds, for the people that wanted his time, his miracles, his attention. At the height of it, wasn't there more? You read through the Gospels and the people, they came, and the crowds got to thousands. And then what did he do to mess it up? He started preaching about self-sacrifice. Not that it wasn't a part of the message before, but you read through in the Gospel of John, it doesn't take very long. John chapter 6, he says, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you've got no part in me. Guess what that does to a crowd? At the end of it, it's the 12, and he says, you guys want to stay around or not? But it wasn't about gathering the multitudes and taking care of everybody. It wasn't always about others. It was about others, but it wasn't first about others. Even Jesus needed a moment of care, a time to renew body, spirit. Had Jesus fortified his time with himself, he might have cured, if he had not taken care of himself. Could he have cured more? He could have cured dozens and dozens of people, but what would it have cost him? Did he make the right decision? I think so. If you're in a plane, and what do they say about the oxygen masks? If the oxygen masks drop, what do you do? Alvin, you haven't flown in a while. What do? They tell you you put it on yourself and then even your own children. Because what's the natural instinct? Reach for the kids first. Take care of them. Unless it's Abby. Then she'd take care of herself. Tear it out of my hand is what she'd do. But there's that instinct to take care of others. So they tell you in a crisis situation, wait a second, take care of yourself and then take care of others. Sometimes we need a reminder to care for ourselves. Jesus may have had that similar thought. Imagine the desperation of those carrying their beloved sick to him. So many people to cure. Everyone begging him to end their suffering. And person after person after. When do you cut the line and say that's enough for today? You know? Because you know, he knows the passion and compassion of these people. You would want to. But there were times when he would say, we've done enough good here, we're moving to another town. So that I can go and preach. Even Jesus needed time to care for himself. If he had forfeited that time, he could have done more, he could have helped more, but it would have hurt him in the end. Everything good in life follows the law of balance. There's a quote by Mother Teresa that said, if you want to keep the lamp burning, you need to keep putting oil in. Is that somebody you can look to and say, that's a tough... There's a life of giving, a life of generosity, a life of taking care of others, but the knowledge, you can only do that if you're putting oil in. You can only do that if you're taking care of yourself. So we see that in the Gospels, and that's why I selected these few passages. It seems to be an odd discussion a bit for Valentine's weekend. Hey, take care of yourself. But you know what? I think Christians need that reminder more than the world. So, the passage, our main passage for today. Matthew 22, 33 through 40 is a pretty familiar passage to us. It says, hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together. One of them, an expert of the law, tested him with the question, Teacher, which is the greatest commandment of the law? Jesus replies in verse 37, Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. So what letter are we up to? You start with, you love God. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it, love your neighbor. And there's two little words there. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two suggestions. They're commandments. It starts with God first, but who's next? You love your neighbor as yourself. You take care of yourself, and out of that, you know how to love others. Self-care is a part of caring for other people. We see that in the life of Jesus. In situations where concentration was really important, when there was a lot of needs being met, he still took time to take care of himself. Back in Matthew 14, 21 through 25, the first part of this, in Matthew 14, 1 through 12, we read that Jesus had just heard about the death of John the Baptist. He's just heard about it, and the first thing that happens is the feeding of the 5,000. He hasn't had time to grieve the loss of his friend. And so it says in verse 21, the number of those who ate was about 5,000 men, besides women and children. In 22, immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up to a mountainside by himself to pray. When evening came, he was all alone, but the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against him. And then on to the next need. During the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. The death of John the Baptist goes into the feeding of the 5,000, and there comes that point. He's fed the 5,000. In this case, he showed the disciples, the apostles, how to feed the 5,000 and the importance of faith. And that's 5,000 people, maybe 15, 20,000 people. He's got a huge opportunity to, spread the gospel, meet the needs, get these people closer to him. Because how many of those people were sick? Or how many people need more teaching? Or how you got this huge crowd, why don't you just keep giving to them until you're done? But he doesn't. He sends the apostles away, puts them in the boat and says, go to the next place. And then he dismisses the crowd. He says, that's enough for you. I need some alone time. And he goes to the mountain and he prays. He's interrupted by off to the next need. But there's that point in the middle of this where he takes time to make sure that he's doing the right thing for the right reason. We read in Luke 6, 12 through 16. Just before he selects the 12 apostles. He doesn't do that out of an emptiness. He does that after a night of prayer. On those days, Jesus went out to a mountainside to pray and spent the night praying to God. When morning came, he called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them, who he designated apostles. Simon, who he named Peter, and his brother Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, son of Alphaeus, Simon, who was called the Zealot, Judas, son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. We read of the list of the 12 and say, that's pretty neat. Look, we have the list of the 12. But before that, there was an important part, that he took time to be with God, a whole night to be in prayer, and to have the Father's opinion. Who do we select? What's going to happen? Talk it through and gain that. We've used this illustration a number of times because it makes sense. The idea of Jesus, yourself, and others, or the JYO model that's often presented, is that if Jesus is the big bucket, what your responsibility as a Christian is to receive from God and then find other people and give what God has given you to them, right? Could be social ministry, could be physical ministry, could be spiritual ministry. Now what? Then you go back to God. But while you're doing this, you're a little bit disconnected from God because you're out emptying yourself. And there are a few people that will reach in and take it from your cup, aren't they? If you're going to give, oh, I like receiving. But what's the problem with this model? How many problems can you see with this model? That's limited size, for one thing. How much filling do you get before somebody's asking you to start emptying? Sometimes not very much. How many cups are in your world? How many people do you have around you and in your life that are waiting for their few drops? And then they want more, and they want more, and they want more. And they need more. And it's valid, and they're realistic. There's another problem, is that this cup is whole. What happens if you start putting some punctures in there? Because God made us all to leak. He didn't make it so we have a reservoir. Do you have a spiritual reservoir of your faith? You might think you do until you go through a dry spell. You realize that drains out over time. God made us to leak, but so is everybody else around us. So the model is, I'll fill you and show you where to go get filled. You have a relationship with Jesus. Don't rely on me to fill you. You have a relationship with Jesus. Come and get filled. If you're interested in what I have, I'll show you where I got it. Just a beggar who's been given bread to show another beggar where to get bread. That's what ministry is. Our cup is not complete. It leaks. God made us that way. And so our responsibility, not that we can't love Jesus, others, and yourself. There's a part of that that's natural. But there's also a part where you need to turn it around and say, because I love God, I have to take care of myself. And there's some of these punctures that I need to put tape on. There's some things in my life I got to have time to take care of. There's some people in my life that I can't really fill their cup right now. You know what? You're going to have to learn to take care of yourself. And knowing the wisdom of who to invest in and how to invest, and also to find other people that say, hey, Trish, would you like some water? You look a little dry. You know? Find other people that invest in you. Because as Christians, we often surround ourselves with people that will take. And a part of gathering together in worship is to be filled with communion, with the message, with fellowship, with prayer requests, with all of it. And when we miss that and we just disconnect from it, we dry up. And then when we connect, we're pretty dry and we need somebody else to fill us. So if you can think of, Alan's already probably on it, 10 different ways where this scenario doesn't work, the illustrations. There are lots of ones why it doesn't work. Not for the long term. You can't be the filler of everybody. That's God's responsibility. So invite people to that connection. So how did Jesus do this? How did he keep renewed through all of this ministry? This is an article from Kate Graham that mentions a few things. How did he renew himself? Well, one thing is when we read through the scriptures, reading it differently, not just his outpouring in his ministry, but look where Jesus was filled. How did he get his cup filled? Is that he spent time with friends. So many stories of the gospel show Jesus eating, drinking, enjoying the company of friends. Jesus even made friends with people who some would consider unworthy, such as tax collectors, mentioned in the Gospel of Mark. And in that, yes, those friends had needs, and he poured a little into their cup. But he had those friendships because they also met his needs. We all have different ideas of what it means to be a friend in different thresholds of how much and the input of the friends that we need. Friendship is so important to leading happy and healthy lives. True friendship brings out the best in us, but it also lets us relax, lets us use the gifts that we have, and it lets us be honest. So how are you doing with this? Is your life too busy to have time for friendships? Real friendships, not acquaintances, but real friendships, give and take relationships. Who could you spend time with this week that you know that they would fill you and you would fill them? Jesus also took time alone. Luke 5:15 and 16. The reputation of Jesus continues to grow. Large crowds gather to hear him, to be healed of their sickness, but Jesus often withdrew to some place where he could be alone and pray. It's crucial to carve out time to be alone, to reflect, to read, to pray, and so on. When we make that time, we're more able to cope with life's joys and life's challenges. So how are you doing with this? Are you spending time alone with God, and how do you spend it? Would you consider setting a time this week? And if you're in the habit of that, which we should be, most of us have been walking with God long enough, how does it make a difference? How does that filling impact the rest of your week? It gets me to Wednesday, where's another filling? And then a little chat with the ladies after ladies class. Quilting was Tuesday, I could visit there for a bit. You know, you connect and you get filled and you make those. It makes a difference. Another thing about being renewed is he took care of his body. We don't have the passages that refer to this. It's more of an assumption because naturally these are ways that we stay renewed. There's not a lot in the scripture about Jesus caring for his body, but the Gospel of Mark tells the story of a woman who anointed Jesus with perfumed oil in Bethany. Some of the apostles questioned the extravagance, but Jesus replied, "Let her alone. Why do you criticize her? She has done me a kindness." Seems reasonable that Jesus knew that taking care of himself, he would be better able to take care of others. So how are you doing the same? How are you with diet and exercise? The basics of it. This body is intended to last you as long as it can. Every body's different, but are you able to? Or what are your habits that are getting in the way of being able to serve the way that God has helped you serve? Taking time to care for the body that God gave us is stewardship that pays off in the long haul. Now, I like to balance this with number one, about being with friends and having food and fellowship. So there's it's not all one or the other, that they all connect together. So this isn't new information. It's a friendly reminder from Scripture. This week, I would encourage you to take the time to care for yourself so that we're helpful in the kingdom and a benefit to others. Try the JYO model and see how God blesses your efforts. I have a specific in mind. It's Saturday from about 9:30 to 2:30. Pretty good way for you to get filled and connected, take care of yourself a bit so that you're better able to take care of other people. The idea about being filled, it's good. We also this week have the Vipers game on Friday night. That's a fellowship opportunity. Right after service, we have a potluck. There's a fellowship opportunity there. There are opportunities that are available to us, the small groups that we have. But it doesn't have to be as formal or as structured as that. Make a phone call. Have a visit. Pray for people. Go for a walk. Enjoy the sunshine. Do what it takes to get a little filling so that you're better able to help for people later on. Next week, the last part of our discussion about love is not only is there a command to love, not only is the example of love put ourselves in a way that it involves self-care, but the last part is handling the question, well, how do you love those that in your opinion are unlovable or less lovable?